Yeah, that's question about translations. Probably the most common one you see nowadays is this one by Austin Flannery. And notice that in this particular one with the green cover, because the other one I think was blue, it says a completely revised translation in inclusive language. You know that church documents are written in Latin, and the word for people or human beings is homo, which that is translated man usually in English, but that's not correct. It should be human. There is another word in Latin, vir, which means a masculine person. So in Latin, homo means a human being, but unfortunately it usually gets translated as man, and at least in the United States, and I think in most English-speaking countries, we're trying to be a little bit more inclusive. There's a half of the human race that doesn't call itself man, so slightly more than half, and so this particular version is inclusive language. So this is a good go to. The original one was Abbott, which I think is still available. That was done extremely rapidly. It was done by a Jesuit. Abbott was a Jesuit in Massachusetts, and he was translating them as they were coming out. He had a whole team of scholars around him in Boston, and they were able to come out with the full translation within a matter of months. So it's a smaller book. It's in red, kind of fat little paperback. 95 cents cost of it. The translation that I use is Tanner. Tanner is an English Jesuit, and this is a 2-volume set with all the ecumenical councils from Nicaea up to the Second Vatican Council. And it has the original language on one page, so in the early days it was Greek, and then Latin, and then English rather. And in this one, it's Latin and then English. So I like it precisely because you can make a reference to the original. Dearden was always keen on that. He says, don't just go with a translation. Look at the text. We wrote it in Latin. We wanted to, that's what we wanted to say. So it's important for scholars, at least. Nowadays, most scholars who quote the Vatican Council use Tanner because they have the Latin text right there in front of them. Okay, so as we are, I'm sure most of us are aware that you can't just pick out a single quotation from these 350 pages of fine print and say, here's what the Vatican Council teaches. There has to be some sense of a trend going, of some way that a given idea gets integrated in several different ways. And so what you have in the Council are the 4 constitutions, and then we have 12 other documents that elaborate on those 4 constitutions. And so that's precisely what they're doing. They're laying out the fundamental foundation stones with these 4 constitutions on worship, on the Word of God, on the church in the modern world. And then the other 12 kind of, all right, let's go with that. And so they take it further in either a decree or a declaration. And what you'll see is that there's some consistency, and what I'm going to do here is show that this particular decree on the Apostolate of Laity actually has its seeds in all 4 of the constitutions, not just 1 or 2, and it comes up in all 4 of them. And that's kind of that's what they say, it's a real sign of the Holy Spirit when a good idea pops up from several different places. You can be much more confident than if it's just one person's ingenious idea. So here you have the example of this at work here. They use the word decree and declaration. A decree is taking a teaching that we already have come to realize in one of the four constitutions in this case, and then apply it. So here's what the church should do about that. Here's how the church will implement that teaching. That's a decree. So it's a direction that now that we have established the principles, here's the way we should act. So that's what that means. A declaration is a little different in that it isn't based primarily on the church's teaching. It's based on the very nature of things. So a declaration declares, since it's true that human beings do, or children have, or whatever, therefore the church ought to respond in this way. So there's only 3 of them, actually. There are 9 decrees and 3 declarations. Interestingly enough, the declaration on religious education, when you think that would be a decree, because it's about teaching catechesis, but it begins with every child has the right to inherit from its elders the values and the vision and the hopes of its community. So the children have a right to be educated, and the church simply has to respond to that right. So that makes it a declaration. So the same with the freedom of conscience, I think, is a declaration. It's based on the right of human beings. Conscience is a right that every human person has. That's a given. Therefore, we then respond in this way. So this is a decree on the apostolate of the laity. The problem with laity is right off the beginning. That was the word that we typically were using. Now, in the earlier church, in the very early church, the word laos in Greek actually means, it means the chosen people, the selected people, a distinguished group. So then you kind of move it, a distinguished group of people. Well, the whole church, all Christians, everybody were laos in Greek because they were chosen people. But what happened was, over the centuries, the people who were the more educated leaders in the church ended up being called the ministers of the church, and everybody else is the laos, is the laity, is the people. And that distinction between the teaching and governing group within the church versus the people themselves became kind of a dichotomy. It's interesting that in many of these documents they don't use the word laity, they use the word faithful, the fideles, fideli. And in canon law, in 1983's Code of Canon Law, they refer to the people not so much, they do use the word laity on occasion, but they frequently use the word Christi fideles. In other words, Christ's faithful. So that really is the proper word, the faithful. That includes everybody. We're all in this together. We're all part of the faithful, whether we're the Pope or the, whatever, us here standing here, we are all the faithful. And the faithful then have this mission of Christ. We all have that mission. And we all have an apostolate to evangelize the world. So that's a fundamental understanding. Now, Congar is probably the one who is most responsible for stimulating these ideas. And he wrote a book about the lay people in the church, and he called it The Lay People in the Church, in the 1950s. He was already at this point under suspicion. Pius XII was a very, as you know from the historical record of Pius XII, but also the theological record, was a very complex person. And he is responsible for some very important movements forward. His encyclical on Scripture studies was groundbreaking. He finally broke the logjam that was preventing Catholic scholars from really using the more contemporary methods of Scripture analysis that the Protestants were using for 100 years. And we simply couldn't do it because we were so afraid of modernism. We all took an oath against modernism since Pius X. My generation, when we were taking it, because we had to do it in order to get ordained, our rationale was, well, these things don't exist anyway. It's like Paul saying, if you hold up a piece of meat in front of this idol, nothing's going to happen to that meat. That idol isn't anything. It hasn't any power. You know? So that meat, yeah, you can eat that for breakfast if you want to, because that idol doesn't exist. There's no God there. Well, modernism, there's no evil there that does that, you know. So yeah, I don't agree with that. I freely swear, I'm not a modernist. But unfortunately, people like Congar got suspected of being modernist. And so, and Pius XII had initiated Scripture studies. He had initiated a whole new look at the church as members of the mystical body of Christ. Two very important encyclicals that really helped to lay the groundwork for this entire council. But he also wrote an encyclical Humani Generis that scared people to death. And suddenly the Curia people are watching for who are these people who are, you know. And so people like Congar got caught up in that witch hunt. Fortunately, his book, Laity in the Church, which many bishops by this time had read. I read it when I was in the seminary. It was an English translation, and Pope John the 23rd had read it. So he specifically invited Congar and several other of these suspect theologians. He invited them to join the theological staff that was helping with the council, to be periti, the experts in the council. So this book, Layperson in the Church, became an important document, a book that was out there. People just knew about it. He actually was revising it right during the council, and it was put into English translation almost immediately under a revised version in 1965. When the volume that I had in English is 1965, which is the same year the council was closing. Congar was an incredibly productive person. I mean, his journal is 900 pages long, the journal of the council, the 4 years of the council. And he was, not only was he working on a couple of these different commissions, but also rewriting Layperson in the Church, and suffering from what turned out to be a real virtual paralysis on his right or left side, I forget which side, that's gradually becoming more and more lame, couldn't walk very well. And he was suffering from that constantly during this time, but still continued to work. So anyway, this particular document is clearly one of the things that they wanted to talk about. So let's first, what I've given you on the reading guide is 2 full pages of the 4 constitutions that we've already talked about. And now we didn't talk about them all very thoroughly, so that's why I figured it was good to kind of do the review. In Dei Verbum, in the one on the Bible, that's a very short document to begin with, and it's basically about just how the Bible should be used and revered in the liturgy and whatnot. But at the very end, they make a reference that is new to most Catholics, that all the faithful should become very familiar with the Bible. Now, there's no teaching in the church, in the dogmas of the church, that Catholics can't read the Bible, even though many Catholics remember being taught that in Catholic school, that we shouldn't read the Bible. What we should have been taught was that you can't just interpret the Bible independently regardless of the church. In other words, the Bible really is the possession of the community of faith. The whole community possesses the Holy Scriptures. It's the community that decided what was going to be in the Holy Scriptures to begin with. So the books of the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, are collected by and revered by the church. And so the church uses this scripture for its public preaching, for its worship, for its private meditation. The Bible becomes the source of our spiritual life. And everybody should be able to be exposed to it. But nobody knew how to read and write for all practical purposes. It was only a very small, select group. If your computer screen goes blue, what are you going to do about it? You're not going to be able to do anything about it. You have to call somebody. Some geek will have to come and help get that computer going again, or tell you the sad news that you've lost everything you had on there. You may be able to send it away to some specialized place. You might be able to retrieve something that you had on there, but you're never going to be able to do that. That's the way it was with reading and writing in the ancient world. There was writing, but very few people knew how to read and write. You depended on the verbal teaching of the church. And it was only from the Protestant Reformation happened to occur right during the time of the invention of printing, of movable type. And so Gutenberg was able to print pamphlets and books very rapidly, and Bibles. So one of the first things he printed was Bibles. So you suddenly have the ability for every home to have a Bible. And so Luther capitalized on that and really promoted every family reading the Bible. The Council of Trent was worried about that because the Protestants seemed to be so independent-minded that it didn't make any difference what the church is teaching. You can just read the Bible on your own and just be your own church if you want to be. So the Council of Trent was reacting against that, saying that no, you've got to read the Bible with the community. So that was what the teaching was. But now it's very clear in the Verbum that everybody, all the faithful, should have a Bible, should read the Bible, should understand the Bible, go to classes where they can learn more about the Bible. It's part of who we are as Christians. You can hardly really develop and grow as a Christian person if you're completely ignorant of the Bible. So that's kind of a given just in that last couple of paragraphs of the Dei Verbum. In the document on the liturgy, the theme song is, all believers are to be led to take a full, active, conscious participation. They say that over and over again. And they say things like, all the faithful are offering the sacrifice with the priest. And because all the faithful are baptized into the priesthood of Christ, and it's Christ who's offering the sacrifice. And so the faithful participate in that. And this document says you not only need to do it, but know what you're doing. So the conscious participation in the worship of the church. So full, active, conscious participation, all the faithful. So this is just said over and over again. It's clear that everybody's involved in this. All right, so those two, it's just kind of a given there. Incidentally, there's also the word ministry, and there's a little dispute about that. In Sacrosanctum Concilium, you have the word ministries that can be applied to lay people. And they speak of the church, the lay people taking part in some of the ministries. Now, technically, the word ministry is a service that certain people in the church are doing for the church. And the way it's being done in the Catholic Church in the last 1,500 years is that the ordained ministers care for the rest of the church, and then the church engages in the apostolate. And so in our doctrine, we're going to talk about today, they're going to hold to that. They're going to speak of the word apostolate all the time. They're not going to talk about ministry very much. But in the one on the liturgy, they do use the word ministries, the lector and the choir and various other ministers. They talk about ministers. So they're a little looser with it here. So there really was a distinction and a debate among the bishops themselves. John Dearden, for example, was of the mind you should only use the word ministry when you meant the ordained ministries. You don't use ministry for other works that the church does. That was his opinion, but lots of other bishops were thinking, no, ministry is broader than that, and you find that. And so that's why you're going to find a difference of opinion. Notice that even in Lumen Gentium, kind of just below the middle of page 1, the sacred pastors are well aware how much the faithful contribute to the, note that they use the word faithful there, contribute to the well-being of the whole church. They, that's the pastors, know that they were not instituted by Christ to undertake by themselves alone the church's whole mission of salvation to the world. It is their noble task to tend the faithful, that would be their ministry, and to acknowledge their ministries. Now we're talking about the lay people, the faithfuls, ministries and charisms. And I looked that up in the Latin to see if that really meant that, and yes, that's what they said. That's a separate clause, and the clause is about the faithfuls, ministries and charisms, so that all may cooperate, each in her or his own way, unanimously to the common task. So in that paragraph of Lumen Gentium, that's paragraph 30, they use the word ministry regarding the work of the lay people as well as the ordained ministers. So even in the Lumen Gentium, which is in some ways the most conservative of the documents, they are ambiguous about it. They use the word ministry there. But then in 40 of Lumen Gentium, all the faithful, whatever their condition or rank, are called to the fullness of Christian life and the perfection of charity. The sacred pastors are to acknowledge and promote the dignity and the responsibility of the laity, and there the word is laity, make use of their prudent counsel, confidently entrust to them offices in service of the church, that would be a ministry, and leave them freedom and space to act. Indeed, encourage them to take up their work on their own initiative. Now, yeah, a sidebar here. Just a couple days ago, I'm not sure what day this occurred, but after Pope Benedict announced that he was going to resign, and before he actually did, he addressed the clergy of Rome, which would be, of course, the appropriate thing to do, because he's not first of all the Pope, he's first of all the Bishop of Rome. So he's the Bishop of the Diocese of Rome, and the clergy of Rome are his clergy. So he spent about a 40-minute talk, he gave it in Italian, to the clergy of Rome. And he began the talk with a fairly gracious and very positive memory of when he was first asked by his bishop, Cardinal Frings, to accompany Cardinal Frings to the council. Before the council began, the cardinal had an interview with some public media and was expressing his ideas of what might happen in a council like this. And they're fairly forward-thinking ideas. And almost immediately, he gets a call from the Vatican to come and meet with the Pope. And he was a little worried that maybe he had overstepped his bounds. The Pope hadn't yet opened the council. He hadn't yet given his opening address, but he had talked about aggiornamento when he first announced the council a year or two before. In any case, now he's suddenly a little worried And he says to Ratzinger, his theologian assistant, he says, oh man, maybe he's going to take my red hat back. So they go to see the Pope. Well, the Pope, on the 23rd, the Pope, as soon as he comes in, the Pope gives him a big box, you know how the Italians, a big hug, you know, and he says, that's exactly what I'm talking about. I just read your interview, that's exactly what I'm talking about. So that was, and so Pope Benedict, about to resign, says this to the priest, and that's his memory of the beginning of the council. And how wonderful it was to have this hope and this idea about the church developing and changing and reforming and all these things. There was a real spirit of reform of the church, and just looking forward to that. So then he went on with his talk, which I had not read. It's in Italian, but my Italian is non-existent at this point. And so at the end, then he comes back to the Vatican Council, and there he gets very sad. And we've seen this before. And he says that there were really two councils. There was the council of faith that the bishops were doing, and there was the council of the secular world as they interpreted it, as if it was two different things. And how sad it is that this secular interpretation without faith has kind of taken over. And hopefully, and then his very last sentence is, hopefully we'll be able to retrieve the council of faith. Now, I'm very sad for him, and maybe the thing we can pray for him while he's in this time of reflection, now that he's not Pope anymore, and has time just to pray and meditate and just experience God's grace, that he may be able, now that he's not Pope anymore, realize that this is, when you read things like, the sacred pastors know very well that the lay people have got to help them, that's what it says. That's a literal reading of the council. That's not the secular media's translation of it. That's what the council's saying. The clergy the laity may take advantage of the prudent counsel of the clergy, but who have confidently entrust to them offices in the service of the church and leave them freedom and space to act. Indeed, encourage them to take up their own initiative. It's the church, So this whole document, in fact, Lumen Gentium has, out of the 8 chapters, 4 of them have to do with the people. Number 2 is the people of God. Number 4, by the way, there's a misprint in the next page. Number 4 is the laity itself. They have a chapter on the laity, and then they have a chapter on the universal call to holiness, and then a chapter on the religious, which is part of really the laity. They're not the hierarchy. So 4 of the 8 chapters are about the people, 3 about ordinary folks. That's not secular interpretation. That is what the bishops were saying. So, if you read that remarks of Bishop DeRue, who was here a couple of weeks ago, he's a great example. And frankly, that's what I remember of the bishops coming back, participating in the council and coming back shortly after. Bishop DeRue symbolizes that's virtually everybody had that experience. Now, granted, he was very young. He was 38 to 42 when this was going on, his age. But Dearden was a seasoned churchman and knew very well the proper way to be a churchman when he came here. But when he went to the council, he was, by the second session, he was bubbling over with enthusiasm over what was going on. Honestly, I feel badly for Benedict that he is so convinced that the council's been hijacked by a secular interpretation. Granted, there may be some individuals who have, I don't know, but the fact that people have, continue to ask, might not women be able to be ordained? That's not a secular sabotage. That's a genuine question that needs to be asked. In fact, by the way, Dearden was convinced. He said, well, we didn't address women being ordained. He said, we probably weren't ready for that yet. But he says, that's going to good, just a matter of time. I can't imitate his voice very well anymore, but it's just a matter of time before that. I accept the fact. Just a matter of time. So I take him at his word. It's just a matter of time. A long time, but... All right. Near the bottom of page 1, 2 distinct forms of the apostolate for all the faithful. Number 1, everyone is commissioned to the apostolate by the Lord himself. In other words, it's the work of the church. Everybody's involved by baptism and confirmation. St. Thomas Aquinas specified that the sacrament of confirmation is precisely the sacrament of apostolate, the acting in the world, acting in the church. Baptism gets you into the church. Confirmation makes you responsible in the church. So baptism and confirmation gives us all the apostolate of the church. Then number 2, the faithful can also be called to more immediate cooperation in the apostolate of the hierarchy. So the hierarchy, they have an apostolate too, or along with. The hierarchy may routinely appoint qualified laypersons to carry out certain ecclesiastical offices. Moreover, in a shortage of sacred ministers, non-ordained people to some extent may also supply some sacred offices. So, no, they don't give a lot of examples, but that would mean, for example, there are several women, unordained, of course, women canon lawyers who work like in the tribunal or in the chancery, so those kind of skills. In fact, we had a chancellor who was a woman for a few years. We don't now, but we did for a while. We could at any time. So there are examples when typically it would have been a priest or a member of the ordained hierarchy, but these things can be done by lay people too. Sadly, there tends to be a reversion to going back only priests doing these things, but as the fewer and fewer priests there are, the more. All right. Notice on top of page 2, there's a mistake in the numbering. The second paragraph, chapters 5, the universal call to holiness, and 6, the religious, do not acknowledge the empowerment of all the faithful as strongly as chapters that you read 2 and 4 would imply. 2 is the people of God, and 4 is the one in the laity. This is chapter 5, the universal call to holiness. I am a little disappointed with this chapter 5. They clearly, whatever committee it was writing this one was still pretty much caught up in the old-fashioned notion that, you know, when they list the various ways that members of the faithful are called to holiness, who do they start with? You'd think they'd start with the people, right? There's more of them than anybody else. No, they start with the bishops. The bishops are called to holiness. And then, after that, the priests are called to holiness. And then, should there ever be deacons, they'd be called to holiness. And then finally, the religious are called to holiness. No, not finally. Oh, yeah, we thought, that was a mistake. We shouldn't have said finally. Even lay people who are married could be called to holiness. The whole tenor of that chapter is just very sad. It's from the old-fashioned manuals of the hierarchy actually defining the holiness. And that's not what that chapter was supposed to do. The whole point of that chapter is the universal call to holiness. And one would think that it's the people who are called to holiness. Each in your own way, I suppose, but anyway. So, all right, nevertheless, those three constitutions really do invite the whole faithful to be involved. And then Gaudium et Spes, of course, because it's about the church in the modern world, really is very thoroughly involved in this, of the faithful involved in the the work of the church. Notice in right about the middle of page 2, the second paragraph after Gaudium et Spes, human dignity requires that we act through free choice, motivated personally from within. Faithful to conscience, Christians unite with all other people in searching for true solutions to the many moral problems which arise in individuals and in society. That's a direct quote. And no one can indulge in a merely individualist morality. As groups and individuals, we cultivate moral and social virtues and propagate them throughout society. Justice and charity are fulfilled when everyone personally contributes to the common good and supports institutions that improve the common good. So that's the whole tenor of the church in the modern world. Near the third paragraph at the bottom, the young who wish to have a more active role to play. Second paragraph from the bottom, secular duties belong principally to the faithful. So the faithful are really involved in the mission of the church's presence in the world. The faithful, enlightened with Christian wisdom, paying careful attention to the magisterium, have their own part to play. All right, so we could just, I think, probably should get into the actual document. Apostolate of the Laity. Kind of a strange name. It's the way it's written, wishing to strengthen the apostolic efficacy. What did I say? I have a different word for efficacy here. Effectiveness of God's people. So the words apostolic effectiveness is apostolicam actuositatem. Apostolicam actuositatem. Apostolic effectiveness. So this document hopes to emphasize that. So they've already been saying that all the faithful should be involved. This document is going to say more explicitly how this is to happen. Actually, this is not completely brand new, so under what is familiar, incidentally, I notice I'm titling these paragraphs, what is familiar, what is developing. When I was at the talk by Bishop Giroux, I bought his book, and so I'm standing in line to get him to sign it, and then I got up to the front, and he opens it up, and I say to him that I'm doing this series, and I said, I found it's kind of interesting to sort of line up what we accepted, what was kind of pretty much familiar teaching, and what is new. And he's writing, and he looks up, and he says, what is new? Why don't you say, what is developing? Because you'll get into less trouble doing that. It is really pretty funny. I was granted, he's 89 years old, and very spry for an 89-year-old. And so that was just a great comment. So there you go. What is familiar and what is developing are the titles of these two columns. So notice that what is familiar, we all have known about faith, hope, and love. So that's pretty familiar. And yet that moves into paragraph 4.6. Following Jesus in poverty, we are neither depressed by lack nor puffed up by abundance. Following Jesus in humility, we do not desire empty glory, but seek to please God above all. Following Jesus in generosity, we cultivate Christian friendship among one another, supporting one another. Now, that is a subtle reference to the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But it's very subtle. Even this document, which makes its focus on the apostolate of of the whole faithful, doesn't really go into any detail about just how all the faithful assume these three basic gospel teachings, poverty, chastity, and obedience, because they're still hung up on chastity meaning unmarried, and so only the priests and nuns are doing that, and obedience being a very lockstep kind of structured obedience that is only known in a monastery. Because those words still kind of connote living in the monastic life rather than among the entire faithful, they weren't able, I don't think, to come up with a really clear way of saying that all of us are called to the evangelical councils. By the way, there's a misprint. Bottom, it shouldn't be evangelical council, C-O-U-N-C-I-L. It should be C-O-U-N-S-E-L. Two different words. Council is the gathering of bishops. Counsel is good advice. So evangelical council. So right from the beginning, the notion of following Jesus in neither being depressed by lack nor puffed up by abundance. That's a nice way to put it. In other words, you don't have to live in abject poverty to be following the counsel of poverty, but rather, neither depressed by lack nor puffed up by abundance. And then humility, do not desire empty glory, but seek to please God above all. Okay, and that would be what the obedience would be. And then following Jesus in generosity, instead of using the word chastity, generosity, love, right? That's the whole point of chastity, is a way of loving God above all things. So following Jesus in generosity, we cultivate Christian friendship among one another and supporting one another. And the world, as a matter of fact. So that would be a way. And this little paragraph, 4.6, is where you would find the statement that says how you can do it. We have to continue to develop that in our own way, but I think that's important. So that means, everybody, and that means all the faithful are called to this, not just very holy people. Yeah, right. Okay. The aims of the apostolate, on page 4. So, the work of redemption is really the saving of human beings, but also the renewal of the whole temporal order. Now, this is a very interesting statement. The whole temporal order, we're talking about the whole of creation. So there's something about the Christian vocation of consecrating the entire universe, of somehow having an influence, having an effect. And so that's why in very recent times, just in the last 10 or 15 years, even the popes can begin to speak about ecology and being concerned for the earth and stuff like that. They are talking about that, finally. But here's why they can talk about it, because they've said 50 years ago that the church's mission is to consecrate, to embrace the renewal of the whole temporal order. So we have a right to be asking questions about global warming and stuff like that. We don't have the answer necessarily, but we need to raise the questions. And we need to be involved in the research and the concern that the fact that all the ice is melting in the universe, in the world, is that a concern to somebody? So we need to raise those questions because we're involved in making the whole world a new creation. In other words, we are participating with God, the Creator. We are engaging because of our conscious being made in the image of God, and then our acceptance of Christ, who has brought God to us and brings us to God. We are then involved in all the aspects of divine life, which includes taking care of our creation. And of course, married people, so co-creators of the children, that's a creative act also, but so is our concern for the community we live in. We're going to get to, well, we'll get to it when we get to it. In paragraph 6.1, the apostolate of the laity and the pastoral ministry complement each other. In the modern world, the laity can explain and defend Christian principles and apply them to modern problems. Now, here, ministry is usually regarding the clergy, the ordained ministers, and the laity are usually doing the mission of the church. So in this document, they're fairly consistent. When they say ministry, they usually mean the ordained ministers. And that would be what Dearden's position was. But just about 10 years ago, copyright 1991. That's even, oh no, that's the Bible's copyright. Where is this copyright? First printing December 2005, so that's 8 years ago. The Council of Catholic Bishops wrote this little book called Co-Workers in the Vineyard. And this actually is the Catholic bishops teaching the churches of the United States how to live this document on the apostolate of the laity. Co-Workers in the Vineyard, a resource for guiding the development of lay ecclesial ministry. Lay ecclesial ministry. Now, in this document, the drafters were using the word ministry very freely to describe the internal service of some members of the church for the other members, which is the ordained ministry, but now the lay ecclesial ministry as well. And so pastoral ministers, religious education coordinators, all these kind of people are engaged in lay ecclesial ministry. There was a debate, now this is just 8 years ago, there was a debate on the floor in Washington, D.C., whether or not it was appropriate to use the word ministry. And some bishops said, no, we can't do that. That's only the ordained minister. That word is reserved to just the ordained. Cardinal Dulles, Avery Dulles, was in attendance. He, by this time, was suffering from the relapse of polio and could hardly walk and was still able to speak pretty clearly, but that failed pretty soon after this. Probably the last time he appeared in public. And he's now a cardinal. And so he, even though he's not a bishop, but he's a cardinal, so he could have been there, you know, if he was still alive. He couldn't have voted, but he could have been there for the meetings ahead of time that are going to go on. He kind of makes his way to the front, and everybody gets very quiet. Because when Dulles speaks, everybody listens, right? So he says, gentlemen, what we're talking with here is formal ministry in the church. These people are called to specific ministries. We have no problem calling this ministry. They do need some formation, they do need to be recognized, but as long as there are those procedures in place where they are recognized to be valuable contributors to the work of the church, and they're formally acknowledged, they can be called ministers. So that settled the issue, and within minutes they voted on this and passed the document. Now they didn't all vote in favor. There were some bishops who still voted against it, but it was a small minority. So, but the point being that this debate about ministry continues right up until the present. But notice what they say, co-workers in the vineyard. So that's taken, of course, from St. Paul. Paul frequently refers to his co-workers. And men and women, and they seem to have had practically pretty much every responsibility you can think of. They seem to have hosted the Eucharist in their homes, whether they actually preside, but maybe so, and women as well as men. He didn't call them, he said some people are called to different things. Some are called to be apostles, some as teachers, some as overseers, some as healers. So he lists apostles among the possible ministries because the apostles are still alive at this point. But in the way the church unfolded, we did not maintain the ministry of apostle. What we ended up with was overseer and presbyter or counselor and deacon or servant. So we ended up with those three fundamental ministries as being kind of the way that the church will carry on. Now that took a couple hundred years to come to that arrangement. Incidentally, in the Church of Rome, the Church of Antioch very quickly became quite hierarchical. And the Bishop of Antioch definitely being in charge, and then a hierarchical structure below the bishop. The Church of Rome, however, was a little looser about that. And there, the presbytery, the communion of the counselors, the presbyters, were pretty much in charge of the church. And they would elect a chair. So when we say the first pope was Peter and the next pope was Celestine or whatever, well, they weren't exactly the pope the way we know the pope today. They happened to be the chair of the presbyters. They were the overseer who was in charge of the well-ordering of the church. And they did it in a collegial way. They did it by having a group of counselors who they called presbyters. That's the Greek word. And then the deacons were actually doing all the work. And there was a head deacon as well as several other deacons. And when you read some of those ancient documents, the kind of work that they were doing, the caring for the orphans and the widows and all the stuff, from soup kitchens, all kind of stuff that they were doing, they really were. The deacons were the ones doing all the work. And of course, they're the ones who had the purse strings because they had to purchase the food for the soup kitchen, right? So that's why some of these early martyrs, Lawrence and Sebastian and the others, they were deacons. And they were arrested because they had the real authority of the church and they had the wherewithal. Take us to the treasury of the church. And so they brought them to the nearest soup kitchen, right? So what we do at St. Christine's is the treasury of the church, right? So that's the way it is. So there are some very early letters from the Church of Rome to other churches, but they're not just from the Pope in Rome. They're from the church, the elders of Rome, writing these letters in the earliest days. That's why these cardinals who are going to elect the next Pope, each one of them is technically the pastor of a church in Rome. They all have a church in Rome. They don't live there, and they got a substitute who's always doing the daily work. But each of those cardinals has a church in Rome because they're part of the Roman clergy, as it were. And so they're the ones who are entrusted to elect the next pope. Now, technically, all those parish priests in Rome ought to be in that conclave. That's the way it was set up. And they should all be in the conclave, not just these 120 cardinals, or 115 cardinals. Whatever number of parish clergy in Rome should be there as well. That would be the way it ought to be. And they should elect the next pope, the next bishop of Rome. And then if he has some jobs with it as being pope, then that's fine. But they're the ones who should elect the bishop. And that's the way we should do it in Detroit, too. That's a side. All right. So the apostolate of the laity and the pastoral ministry complement each other. So in the modern world, the laity are out in the world. And so, obviously, the official clergy just can't be in all those places. Now, occasionally you have, like the movie On the Waterfront, where it's a priest who is, the kind of one of the key figures there. And so that's kind of that notion of the worker priest that you had in France and some of the big cities in the United States too. But they were inspiring the others, the lay people, to do their work. Okay. So paragraph 8.4, charitable, third sentence, charitable activity nowadays can and should embrace all people and all needs. Wherever there are those who lack food and drink, clothes, a home, medicine, employment, education, whatever is needed for living a truly human life, those who suffer from the hardships of ill health, exile, or imprisonment. They should be sought out by Christian charity. And this obligation binds especially those individuals and people who enjoy prosperity. That's us. Next paragraph, middle of the paragraph of 8.5. The demands of justice should be satisfied at the outset, so as to avoid giving in charitable gifts what is due in the name of justice. The causes of evils, not just the effects, should be eradicated. Aid should be given in such a way as the recipients are gradually freed from external dependence, becoming self-sufficient. Very important. So the notion of Christian service has 2 feet. One foot, yes, you do have St. Christine's Soup Kitchen, but the other foot is, when are we going to get to a time when you're not going to need to have a soup kitchen? If you drive down Burr Road here on Wednesday afternoon, it's amazing how many people are waiting for the Forgotten Harvest truck to come to get the food. And they've already been to St. Christine's the day before for a bag of pancakes. Maybe they have, some of them have. But that's just incredible how many people need to have this wait in line just to get a bag of food. But the cause of justice needs to be cared for. So what happened Thursday night at the Brightmoor Community Center to get every kid in school every day, you know, that project, that's looking for the future. That's looking for the future. Let's use an example here. Here's an article in yesterday's paper. This is about the Volunteer Reading Corps. It started about 3 years ago. And there's 2 people. There's actually Christine Lang, who some of you probably know. She's involved in the church and had a heart attack here a year or so ago, and now she's back at it. She's one of the volunteers. There's 800 of these volunteers now, and they tutor kids in reading who are a little bit behind. This kid happens to be only 7 years old, but they'll work with any kid who's behind in reading. There's 800 of them. The very first volunteer, the premier volunteer, was a guy named Mark Durfee. This is Mark Durfee. Looks like Santa Claus. His beard isn't quite white yet, but it's getting there. Kind of looking pretty scruffy, as a matter of fact. But by the crinkling around his eyes, you can't see his face, but his mouth, but obviously he's smiling. And he's holding this card up. Here's a better image. And this kid had just discovered something about whatever's on that card. So now I knew Mark Durfee when he was this kid. I just happened to know by accident, and I happen to know because I'm on Facebook, and so is he, that he is the first person that he was trying to get his classmates from St. Francis de Sales to also become volunteers, right? And so I've been knowing he's been doing this for 3 years. And he was a snarky kid. He was one of these kids who's too smart for his own good and got in trouble because he'd be outwitting the nuns all the time. But here he is, teaching a kid how to read. So clearly it's having some effect. When you see a kid this excited over reading, you've got success. This is the apostolate of the minute of the laity, right? This is the church at work. This is doing justice, making sure that kids of that age are able to read. That's justice. So that's what they're talking about here. This is very on target. Paragraph 10. Sharing in Christ's priestly, prophetic, and kingly office. Notice that they use that little trilogy, priestly, prophetic, and kingly. That's a little bit archaic language, but those 3 functions of Christ. Jesus is the one that brings us to God and God to us. That's the priestly function. Prophetic is the teaching function, the formation process. And kingly is the administration to make sure that all this continues to go and develop. The laity are active in the church's life and work, supporting the pastors. They can bring back those who have wandered. They can pass on the Word of God. They can help in the care of souls and administer the church's goods more effectively. So that's parish councils, parish finance councils, working in any kind of thing, running schools, that kind of thing. By the way, these 4 pictures here are the founding pastors of Christ the King Parish. And so the very first priest is way over there on the right, and then over on the left is Sister Ann Fix, right? She, IHM, she was the first principal of Christ the King School. Been here about 10 or 15 years. So she's one of the founders of the church. Those sisters, they had as much responsibility as the pastor did, or more. A more difficult job, more complex job than the pastor did. And of course, there's a certain amount of moral support they got. Sister said was about as important as the Pope said. but you know, look at the ministry they did, teaching in school 5 days a week, very large class, 50, 60 kids sometimes in a classroom. And then on Saturdays, what were they doing? They weren't watching TV. They were out at Northville teaching delinquent kids at the boys' reform school on Saturdays. So this kind of thing, you know, this is the laity. Now, granted, they're religious sisters, so they're dedicated to the formal life of poverty, chastity, and obedience in a religious community. But basically, they are among the laity. They're not part of the clergy. And they carry on the work of the church. So we continue to carry on in that regard. Young people exercise more influence in society. Their zeal can be an effective part of the apostolate. And this is a real issue in our church today. Young people are not very visible in the church, and we have some responsibility, we who organize what goes on Sunday morning, to try to make it be more attractive for young people. Catholics skilled in public affairs should cooperate with the people of goodwill toward promoting the common good. This includes international affairs. Notice on page 5, there's different types, different levels, different ways of organizing this, so different forms of the apostolate. 16. Laypersons can exercise the apostolate as individuals. Indeed, the apostolate is the vocation and duty of all. Now, this is a development, and this is fairly challenging. Up until recently, people would talk about whether or not they are a practicing Catholic, right? So what did it mean to be a practicing Catholic? You were serious about the 6 precepts of the church, right? What are the 6 precepts of the church? Go to Mass on Sundays and holy days, right? That's one of them. Fast and abstain the days appointed. Make your Easter duty, confess sins, at least mortal sins, at least once a year, and then make your Easter duty. So that's 4. That's fasting and abstaining. Yeah, that's 5. Contribute to the support of the church. Pay, pray, and obey. Right? 6. Now this one, actually, this is not universal. There were 2 different lists of the precepts of the church, and when you only have 5, you're done. But if you count 6, there's a 6th. And that is, obey the laws of the church regarding marriage. And that was the one in the United States and England. We, the English-speaking countries, had 6. And that's what we learned in the Catechism. Now, that's what it meant to be a practicing Catholic. And many Catholics did go to church every Sunday, much more than any other Christians. And so we just kind of look on that as being a practicing Catholic. But this is taking it another step. This is saying that every Catholic, by baptism, it has a vocation to be involved in the apostolate, to actually be working in the church, to actually be engaged in the work of the church. This is more than just contributing on Sunday morning. Now granted, coming to church on Sunday is going to be pretty important there, and so is the financial support. But really, the engagement of the people, so like what Mark Durfee and Christine Lang are doing, that's engaged in the work of the church. Now in some places, the church is curtailed. Now keep in mind, 1965, the Iron Curtain is still up. And so there are many parts of the world where the church is underground. And in China, there's two churches in China, the underground Catholic Church and the officially approved Catholic Church. And the two of them don't get along very well. But that's the way it is there. So sometimes the only people who can even be about the work of the church, the only people who preserve the presence of the Catholic Church in China for many years was the underground church. All the clergy were either killed or imprisoned. So that's what they're referring to there. Then they notice not only individuals, but since we are social by nature, it's good for laypersons to come together into more or less formal associations. Sometimes the apostolate can be effective only by common action, and common association supports and participates in their goals, especially when they mention working environment. We're talking about labor unions in that regard. So sometimes individuals don't have much leverage, and you have to associate in a group. Now, look over to what is familiar, number 20. There they give an example of a very formal, and it had a name. It was called Catholic Action. We don't hear the word as much anymore, but it was still very popularly used in 1965, helping with the hierarchy in the hierarchy's apostolate. In other words, a conscious pledge to consult with, be with the hierarchy in the hierarchy's responsibility. So their immediate aim is the apostolate of the church to evangelize and sanctify communities and environments. So they were in the world, but as an almost public, officially delegated person in the world. So they cooperate with the hierarchy in discerning pastoral needs. Now granted, they use the observe, judge, and act method, so they were looking at their own experience, but they're constantly thinking, now how can we make the church present here? And they act under the direct authority of the hierarchy by some kind of explicit mandate. Now that didn't mean the bishop had to be at all your meetings, but they did expect the parish priest would be at the meetings. So they expected that these groups would actually be working under the auspices and sort of as a spiritual director. So even today, the St. Vincent Paul Society, kind of in the old manual, still expects the parish priest to be the spiritual director. Practically, none of us have time to do that anymore, so you delegate that to a deacon or some other person in the church who can be the spiritual director. So that's a formal Catholic action. Now, but these other things, under 16, 17, 18, and 22, you're talking about a variety of other ways that are not quite as formal as that. And they even include individuals who dedicate themselves living in community. So that would be the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. Here at Christ the King, we have a volunteer corps. There are 6 of them living in a house together. Some of them teach in our schools, some work in community work. So that kind of thing, where you actually form a kind of a dedicated community together. And usually that's temporary nowadays. They don't make a lifetime commitment. It's a year, 2 years, whatever. All right. Preserving due order. There's where they're kind of concerned to make sure that there is some contact with the teaching, organizing life of the church. So they don't want people just kind of going off on their own. And so there are disputes about whether or not a Catholic hospital can call itself Catholic, whether or not right now there's a dispute going on is Catholic Social Services of Wayne County, part of the Catholic Church, and this kind of thing. So there are some disputes about how, what are the chain of command. That's, when I was working in the Christian Service Department, we had 6 offices, one for aging, one for political affairs, one for social services. So there was a person responsible for all of the Catholic social service agencies in the 6 counties of the diocese. And so that was the official link to the church. For some reason, now granted, much of their funding comes from the United Way and stuff like that. So they don't depend on the church directly for a lot of funding. They get their funding from grants and from the general population who contributes to the work of goodness and charity in the world, and that's how they got their funding, but they operate under the auspices of the church. Now, why there is now a Catholic Charities person, and yet there's, so what's going on there? So, I don't know, and I can't say it's right or wrong. I just know that it's different, and there seems to be some distance, which is kind of sad, I think. All right, well, let's get finished here. Number 29, formation for the apostolate presumes a complete human formation adapted to the person's talents. Now, on the one hand, they say everybody's called to this. Then they say that you've got to have a complete formation. Well, nobody's perfect, and any given meeting of parishioners over anything is going to have a variety of personalities, and may not all be completely formed in personal talents. Notice they mention the observe, judge, and act method. 30.1-4, education of children involved in the parish life, apostolic associations. Very last line, number 33, the council calls all the faithful to respond freely and generously. Even now, the Lord is sending us into every city and place where He intends to come. Let them adapt themselves to the new needs of the hour. So that's how the document ends. Well, all right, so that's the apostolate of the laity, the activating the apostolate of the faithful. Oh, wait, microphone, and get somebody else to run the microphone around. I'm not going to leave the stand here.
About this complete human formation, some people just have a formation by living and reading and to do some job?
Yes, and generally that's how it happens. And then you also probably have some association, some of your friends also read the same things, and you kind of meet with one another, and even socially you may actually be engaging in that kind of honing your attentiveness to your life as a Christian in the world, not just as an individual.
I remember my father, who had a 7th grade education, and he had the best understanding of Christian living. As anybody that.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
People are constantly confused by terms like evangelization, apostolate, and all of these terms. Can you give us a simple definition of apostolate that we can take when we have these discussions?
Well, they say the mission is, that very first line, to evangelize the world and transform, what is it? They transform the universe? What is that line? I think it's on page 2. I would use that as the definition. Well, and on top of page 2 is from Gaudium et Spes. No, that's from Church of the Modern World. A new humanism is being born, in which the human person is defined above all in terms of responsibility to sisters and brothers and to history. That's a part of it. But I would say that combined, there it is, top of page 4, Christ's work of redemption primarily concerns the salvation of human beings, but also embraces the renewal of the whole temporal order. That's the lay apostolate. That's the apostolate of the church, not just of laity, but of the church. The salvation of human beings and the renewal of the whole temporal order. So we're all conscious of that. Now that would mean your formation is basically in the field in which you're working. So, if you're an attorney, well then you're going to be trying to practice law in such a way that you bring about God's justice as well as just the particular court that you happen to be working in. And a great example of that in this city in the 1930s was what they called the labor schools, where working people, and a lot of these folks didn't even have a high school education, working at Dodge, Maine and whatnot, and they were meeting with one another in church basements, reading Quadragesimo Anno. They were reading the church's social teachings, and that's how the labor unions got it going. So Walter Reuther and those folks, they were trained precisely. They were formed by the church's teaching about the rights of working people, but it was from the point of view of their environment as working people in these factories.
So union's not a bad thing?
No. No, collective bargaining would be exactly what they're calling for here. That would be, you can't always do things as individuals. You sometimes have to form associations. Yes, here we go over here.
When you were talking about, on that same sentence at the top of it, when you first mentioned it about how they were involved with the whole of creation, and in terms of now thinking about the environment, that I all of a sudden remembered that not only was it the start of the 50th anniversary of the start of Vatican II, but it was the 50th, in October it was the 50th anniversary of Rachel Carson's publishing her book, Silent Spring.
Silent Spring, that was the same time, yes. Yeah.
And so I'm sure that they thought about, that brought that to consciousness.
It's interesting, that was also that crisis in the Cuban Missile Crisis too. So you had several things coming together there simultaneously. And the Vietnam War was really heating up. By 1965, 61 and 62, it was still relatively contained police action, but as advisors. But by 1965, by the time this council was finished, the war in Vietnam was really, really hot. And of course, then there's also protests in the streets and whatnot too at that time. Yes, in fact.
Do you have any insights or understanding, just talking about the ministries of the laity now involved, especially in the diocese? There's some primarily lay people who are doing the religious education, formation, economy, all the different layers of ministries. And there's a big focus the last couple of years about this formation, getting certified. But then, perhaps because I'm old, it just seems, so much. So I just wonder if you have any insights or comments on where this is all going.
Well, there's a certain thing to be said for life experience, right? You may not have the master's degree in religious education, but you may have 50 years of experience of teaching, in your case, Bible schools and stuff like that. So yeah, the bishops are concerned to make sure that there is proper formation. If you're going to call it ministry, then you do have to have some kind of programs of formation where there's some kind of certification. But I would say that's probably best employed with younger people who are thinking of doing this as a profession. So they're thinking of working for the church, and if not full-time, at least in a substantial way. And so they might want to get certified as a youth minister or in religious education or whatever. And this gives them a target to shoot for, a program, a systematic program that includes things like classroom management or wherever else is needed for the kind of thing you're doing. So there is a place for that kind of formal education and a certification of these various ministries and co-working in the vineyard. But right now we're at a time where many of you have the experience of many years without ever having to have formal classes in these things. You've just been doing it for all of your life. And so there has to be some way of accepting that life experience. And there always will be, since everybody's called to the apostolate, there always will be people who will be kind of coming into view and who have some experience, either working with the kids in their neighborhood or whatever it might be, who can bring that interest and that confidence right into the official, recognized life of the church. And of course, mainly, church is at the parish level. So this usually occurs at the local parish. So gradually, it often happens that people get involved in one of the other commissions of the parish, and they become known as expert in a given field. So, yeah, I think there's a place for formal training and acknowledgement. And part of that also means the acknowledgement. There needs to be a commissioning where you state who is the one who is going to be representing this ministry in our parish. That make sense?
As a laity that is in parish ministry, I can remember years ago when Sister Rosemarie Kiefer hired me at Our Lady Gate of Heaven then, and Father Dennis hired me St. Suzanne's. So I was Christian Service and DRE, but they looked at my gifts and they looked at the talents that I had, but there was the encouragement from the beginning to get certified, to go to school. So from that, sort of like that entrance into the ministry, it was always the encouragement. And then toward the end, I would say that it helped me, even as a woman of my age. So I really encourage always young people to, if they feel as if they've been called, to get the certification. But I can say for myself, I don't think I may have been hired here at Christ the King on my gifts, but I think they were also looking at not only my experience, but what foundation I had. So I think it's a real importance to have that, and it's ongoing, because I always say to everyone, I know this much, and so I'm constantly looking to learn. So I think it's important for the laity to be certified.
And there are full-time college programs too. Sadly, Marygrove no longer has its special department in pastoral ministry. And I think you may have taken some classes there at Marygrove doing that. UAD Mercy, I think, still does. But sometimes some people enrolling in college and doing an entire college career is a bit much, depending on what they want. But if you're going to work full-time at a ministry, well then you probably should have at least some kind of college credit for some of this, even if you don't have a degree in it as such.
One of the things I have noticed on the certification, I just happened to see it recently, and I don't know how everybody is involved in their world, but there's much more of a push I saw in there for diversity, to have people get involved in ecumenical activities, which I hadn't seen in some of the individuals that were running some of the programs now. And now I'm seeing them show up at some of the interfaith activities because basically it's part of, or diversity because it's part of their certification. So in some ways, I think that part of it in particular would be a plus. Because I think sometimes people do hold back and stay in their church communities when all around them there are the ecumenical issues going on, at least where I live. And here we are in an area of Dearborn, which is, a very large Muslim community. Yes. And there hasn't been a lot of times, even when they're down the street around the corner, a lot of that kind of interaction, getting more so, but I haven't seen it within people that are teaching in the church. I just wanted to comment on that. So I think that's a plus in there.
Yeah, and they got more work to do. Especially in the African American and Hispanic communities. The Hispanic communities are traditionally Catholic, although they're being kind of often attracted to more evangelical churches. The African American churches, very few of them are Catholic, and they still look on the Catholic Church as a white church. So there needs to be much more diversity and representation in terms of all the dimensions of ministry that are represented in these different cultures. Because 95% of religion is culture. I got that quote from a sociologist in Chicago who should know. And he works with church organizations there. And 95% of religion is culture. Don't you know that? That's what he said to me in good Chicago language. And I agree with that. That is true. So that's a part of the responsibility of the organized church to bring forward representatives of all the world population that are in a given diocese. And we have a lot of work to do in that regard.
I teach Introduction to Christian Worship down at the Ecumenical Theological Seminary, where you can get an MDiv if you want. Catholics are welcome. And one of the things that I learned as preparing to teach the class is that the culture always wins. And that's why I know there will be women's ordination and married priests and all that stuff, because that's where the culture's moving. The church hasn't caught up to it yet, but hey, we've always been slow.
Well, I think we've finished our time, so we'll wrap it up for this. We'll see you next week, and next week it's the missionary activity of the church, I think. So we'll see you in the next one.